They tied her to the stake, wood soaked in oil. Her eyes didn't flinch, and when the flames rose, she whispered something they never forgot. The year was 1628. The place, Würzburg, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Anna Riedemann, a 43-year-old midwife, mother of 3, respected healer of her community. In 6 months, she would be dead, burned alive for crimes that existed only in the fevered imagination of her accusers. Let's go back and see how she ended up here. It was the early 17th century. Europe was bleeding. The 30 Years' War had turned the continent into a charnel house. Catholic fought Protestant. Prince battled emperor. Armies swept across the landscape like locusts, leaving famine and plague in their wake. In this world of chaos, people desperately sought someone to blame. The harvest failed? Witchcraft. Children died of fever? Sorcery. Lightning struck the church. The devil's work. When the natural order collapsed, supernatural explanations filled the void. The Holy Roman Empire, fragmented into hundreds of competing principalities, became the epicenter of witch persecution. Prince bishops like Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn in Würzburg and Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim in Bamberg turned witch hunting into an industry. Between 1626 and 1631, these 2 territories alone executed over 1,600 people for witchcraft. But this wasn't medieval superstition. This was Renaissance Europe, the age of Galileo and Shakespeare, of scientific revolution and artistic flowering. The witch hunts represented not the darkness of the Middle Ages, but the pathological extremism of early modernity. The intellectual foundation for this horror had been laid in 1487 with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor whose own superiors had rejected his methods as too extreme. This manual provided a pseudo-scientific framework for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. The Malleus claimed that women were particularly susceptible to diabolic influence due to their weaker nature. It detailed how witches supposedly flew through the air, copulated with demons, caused impotence in men, and murdered infants. Most dangerously, it argued that mere suspicion was sufficient grounds for torture, and that torture would inevitably reveal the truth. By 1628, this toxic ideology had infected courts across Catholic Europe. The Protestant regions were hardly immune. Witch trials raged in Lutheran territories and Calvinist strongholds with equal fury. Fear, it seemed, was ecumenical. Anna Riedemann lived in Würzburg, seat of one of the most powerful prince-bishoprics in the Holy Roman Empire. The city sat strategically on the main river, its fortress cathedral Marienburg looming over the medieval streets below. Under Prince Bishop Julius Ector, Würzburg had become a model of counter-Reformation zeal. New churches rose from the cobblestones. Jesuit schools educated the elite, and the Inquisition kept careful watch over souls. Anna worked as a midwife, one of the most essential yet precarious professions of her time. She delivered babies, prepared herbal remedies, and tended to women's ailments. In a world where medical knowledge was primitive and infant mortality approached 50%, midwives like Anna stood between life and death on a daily basis. This proximity to birth and death made midwives simultaneously revered and feared. When a birth went well, they were blessed healers. When complications arose, they became convenient scapegoats. The Malleus Maleficarum had specifically targeted midwives, claiming they murdered newborns as offerings to Satan and used their professional access to spread malevolent magic. Anna's troubles began in the winter of 1627. A series of stillbirths in the city coincided with an outbreak of fever among children. Rumors began to circulate. Neighbors whispered about Anna's success with difficult births. Surely supernatural. Her herbal knowledge seemed suspicious. Her independence as a widow raised eyebrows. The paranoia was fed by a perfect storm of circumstances. The 30 Years' War had brought Swedish Protestant armies perilously close to Würzburg. Refugees flooded the city, straining resources and heightening tensions. Harvest failures had driven food prices to dangerous levels. Prince Bishop Julius Ector, now in his 70s, faced pressure from Rome to demonstrate his orthodox zeal. In this atmosphere, the witch hunter Johann Riedemann arrived in Würzburg. Riedemann was a professional, one of the traveling inquisitors who made their living extracting confessions from suspected witches. He came with credentials from Rome and a reputation for thoroughness. Under his supervision, the Würzburg trials would claim over 300 lives in just 5 years. Reichardt's method was systematic. He began by identifying suspected witches through denunciations, accusations made under torture by previous victims. These unfortunates, desperate to end their agony, would name anyone they could remember. A business dispute, a family quarrel, a moment of social awkwardness. Any interaction could become evidence of diabolic conspiracy. Anna's name first appeared on such a list in January 1628. Maria Hoffmann, a baker's wife undergoing torture, gasped out Anna's name along with a dozen others. The accusation was vague, something about a curse cast during a difficult birth 3 years earlier. But in the logic of the witch hunt, vague accusations were often the most damning. They suggested hidden evil, secret malevolence that required expert investigation to uncover. The legal framework that condemned Anna Riedemann was not the product of mob hysteria or medieval ignorance. It was a sophisticated system of jurisprudence, refined over decades by Europe's finest legal minds. The Carolina Charles V's Criminal Code of 1532 had established torture as a legitimate tool for extracting confessions. Subsequent legal commentaries by scholars like Benedict Karpsov had fine-tuned the process specifically for witchcraft cases. The theory was elegant in its circular logic. Since witchcraft was a crime in exceptum, an exceptional crime that threatened both temporal and spiritual order, normal legal protections could be suspended. Evidence that would be insufficient for theft or murder became compelling for sorcery. Hearsay, circumstantial details, and the testimony of criminals gained probative weight. Most crucially, the presumption of innocence was effectively reversed. The accused had to prove their innocence, rather than the prosecution proving guilt. When Anna was arrested on February 15, 1628, she entered a system designed to extract confessions rather than determine truth. The process began with the territio, the showing of instruments. Anna was taken to the torture chamber and shown the rack, the strappado, and the thumb screws. She was told exactly what would happen to her body if she refused to confess. The psychological impact was often sufficient to break the accused before physical torture began. Anna, however, maintained her innocence. This defiance was itself seen as evidence of guilt. The devil was giving her supernatural strength to resist. The examining judge, Dr. Johann Georg Hahn, noted in his meticulous records that Anna's steadfast denials proved her complete corruption by evil forces. The torture began with the strappado. Anna's hands were bound behind her back as she was hoisted by rope, her shoulders bearing her full weight. Weights were added to her legs to increase the agony. As her joints separated and ligaments tore, the torturers demanded confession. What was her relationship with the devil? When had she first renounced Christ? How many children had she murdered through witchcraft? For 6 hours, Anna refused to confess. Her resilience only confirmed her guilt in the minds of her torturers. If she were truly innocent, they reasoned, God would have granted her the strength to confess and seek mercy. Her continued denials proved the devil's hold over her soul. The systematic nature of the interrogation followed patterns established across Catholic Europe. First came questions about the Sabbat, the supposed gathering where witches worshiped Satan. Anna was asked to describe the location, the participants, and the rituals. When she insisted she had never attended such gatherings, the torturers increased the pressure. Next came questions about maleficia, harmful magic. Had she caused the stillbirths through curses? Had she spread disease through her herbs? Had she used her position as midwife to murder infants for Satan? Each denial brought fresh agony. The logic was inexorable. If she were truly innocent, she would confess to save her soul. Her refusal to confess proved her guilt. The process was designed to be inescapable. Confession led to execution. Refusal to confess proved diabolic possession and also led to execution. The only variable was the amount of suffering the accused would endure before their inevitable death. By the third day of torture, Anna's resistance began to crack. Sleep deprivation, physical agony, and psychological pressure had reduced her to a broken wreck. When Dr. Hahn promised that confession would end her suffering, she finally spoke the words they wanted to hear. "I am a witch." Anna's confession, extracted under torture and carefully recorded by court scribes, followed the standard template established by decades of witch trials. She admitted to first encountering the devil 7 years earlier, during a period of grief following her husband's death. The devil had appeared as a handsome stranger, offering comfort and promising power over life and death. In her vulnerability, she had accepted his bargain. The confession detailed her initiation into witchcraft through carnal union with Satan, her attendance at sabbats held at the Marienburg fortress above Würzburg, and her participation in blasphemous rituals mocking the Catholic Mass. She admitted to causing the recent stillbirths through malevolent magic, spreading fever among children, and using her position as midwife to murder newborns as offerings to her demonic master. Most damaging of all, Anna was forced to name accomplices. Under continued torture, she provided a list of 17 other women who had supposedly attended the sabbats with her. These names were carefully recorded and cross-referenced with previous denunciations. Within days, warrants were issued for their arrest. This expansion of accusations was the hallmark of the Great Witch persecutions. Each confession generated new suspects, creating an ever-widening circle of terror. It could theoretically encompass entire communities. The mathematical progression was terrifying. If each accused witch named 10 others, and each of those named 10 more, a single initial accusation could metastasize into thousands of deaths. Among those Anna named was her own daughter, Elisabeth, aged 22. This detail particularly satisfied her interrogators, as it confirmed diabolic beliefs about the hereditary nature of witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum had taught that witch mothers passed their corruption to their children, creating dynasties of evil that could persist for generations. Elisabeth's arrest followed within a week. Unlike her mother, she broke quickly under torture, confirming Anna's confession and adding new details about their shared diabolic activities. Mother and daughter were housed in adjacent cells in Würzburg's Marienburg fortress, their cell windows too high to allow communication, but close enough that each could hear the other's screams during interrogation. The theological implications of Anna's confession were carefully analyzed by the court's spiritual advisors. Father Johannes Dresser, a Jesuit scholar brought in to evaluate the case, concluded that Anna's corruption was so complete that salvation was impossible. She had not merely committed sins. She had fundamentally perverted her nature through diabolic alliance. Only death could cleanse the community of her contamination. This theological judgment reflected a profound shift in Catholic doctrine during the Counter-Reformation. Earlier medieval Christianity had emphasized mercy and the possibility of redemption, even for the worst sinners. But the witch trials introduced a new category of irredeemable evil, humans so corrupted by Satan that they had effectively ceased to be human at all. The legal proceedings moved swiftly toward their predetermined conclusion. Anna was formally sentenced on April 3, 1628, exactly 7 weeks after her arrest. The sentence was read in Latin and German to ensure she understood both the legal and spiritual dimensions of her condemnation. She was declared guilty of heresy, apostasy, and malevolent witchcraft. Her property was confiscated to pay the costs of her prosecution and execution. Her body was condemned to death by fire. The efficiency of Anna's destruction reflected the bureaucratization of persecution that characterized the great witch hunts. What had once been sporadic outbursts of communal violence had evolved into systematic campaigns administered by professional lawyers, theologians, and executioners. The Würzburg court processed witchcraft cases with the same methodical precision, applied to tax collection or military conscription. Anna Riedemann's execution was scheduled for April 10, 1628, to coincide with the spring, assizes when the maximum number of witnesses would be present in Würzburg. Public executions served multiple purposes in early modern Europe. They demonstrated the state's power, provided moral instruction to the populace, and theoretically offered the condemned a final opportunity for repentance and salvation. The preparations began at dawn. A wooden platform was erected in the city's main square, surrounded by concentric circles of wooden stakes driven deep into the cobblestones. Bundles of kindling, seasoned wood, and straw were carefully arranged to ensure maximum combustion. The executioner, Hans Vollmer, supervised these preparations with professional attention to detail. An efficient burning required precise engineering. Too little fuel would prolong suffering, while too much might obscure the moral spectacle that justified the entire enterprise. Anna was brought from her cell at 8 in the morning, dressed in a yellow robe marked with painted flames and demons, the traditional garb of condemned heretics. Her hair had been shaved to prevent any hidden charms from interfering with the flames. A paper mitre decorated with devils was placed upon her head. These humiliating preparations served to transform her from human being to demonic symbol, making her destruction psychologically easier for the watching crowd. The procession to the execution site followed established ritual. Anna walked barefoot through Würzburg's streets, accompanied by 2 priests offering final opportunities for confession and repentance. Behind her marched representatives of the secular and ecclesiastical authorities, whose cooperation had made her destruction possible. The crowd that lined the route numbered in the thousands. Residents of Würzburg, joined by peasants from surrounding villages, who had traveled specifically to witness the spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe Anna's demeanor during this final journey as resigned but dignified. She did not weep or plead for mercy, nor did she curse her accusers or proclaim her innocence. This stoicism was interpreted differently by different observers. The authorities saw it as evidence of diabolic hardening. Satan was preventing her from showing proper contrition. Some spectators viewed it as proof of innocence. Surely only a righteous person could face death with such composure. The execution itself followed procedures refined through decades of witch burning across Catholic Europe. Anna was chained to the central stake, her arms secured behind her back to prevent gestures that might be interpreted as attempts at magical retaliation. Bundles of dry wood were stacked around her feet, rising to her waist. Green wood was placed on top to create dense smoke that would hasten unconsciousness. As the torches were applied to the kindling, Father Dresser made a final appeal for Anna to confess any remaining sins and name any accomplices she might have concealed. She responded in a voice barely audible above the crackling flames, "I forgive you all." These would be her final words, recorded by multiple witnesses and debated by theologians for months afterward. The actual burning lasted approximately 30 minutes. Contemporary medical knowledge suggests Anna likely died from smoke inhalation within the first 10 minutes, before the flames reached her body. But the symbolic destruction continued until nothing remained but ashes and charred bone fragments. These were collected and scattered in the main river to prevent any possibility of diabolic resurrection. The immediate aftermath of Anna's execution revealed the complex dynamics that drove witch persecution. Her death did not satisfy the community's appetite for scapegoating, but rather intensified it. Within days, all 17 women she had named under torture were arrested. The spiral of accusation and execution that would consume Würzburg for the next 3 years had begun in earnest. Elisabeth Riedemann was burned 6 days after her mother, on April 16th. Her execution drew an even larger crowd, as mother-daughter witch pairs were considered particularly fascinating examples of hereditary evil. The court records note with satisfaction that Elisabeth S. ashes were mingled with her mother S. and scattered together in the river, a symbolic reunion in damnation. The persecution that claimed Anna Riedemann was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a continental catastrophe that reshaped European society. Between 1450 and 1750, the witch hunt spread like plague across every territory from Scotland to Sicily, from Portugal to Poland. To understand how this happened, we must examine the deeper currents that transformed medieval Europe into a hunting ground for imaginary demons. The roots of the Great Persecution lay in the profound transformations of the 15th century. The Black Death had killed 1/3 of Europe's population, shattering medieval certainties about divine providence and social order. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian unity, creating competing versions of truth that fought for supremacy with sword and stake. The Little Ice Age brought crop failures, famine, and demographic crisis that lasted for generations. In this world of uncertainty, witchcraft provided a comprehensive explanation for suffering. When harvests failed, it was because witches had cursed the fields. When children died, it was because sorceresses had stolen their life force. When storms destroyed crops or floods swept away bridges, it was because diabolic agents had manipulated natural forces for evil purposes. The witch became the universal scapegoat, responsible for every misfortune that befell Christian communities. The intellectual framework for this campaign of terror was provided by the Church itself. The papal bull Summus Desiderantus Effectibus, issued by Pope Innocent VIII in 1484, officially recognized the reality of witchcraft and authorized inquisitors to pursue diabolic conspiracies wherever they might be found. This document gave ecclesiastical sanction to what would become the greatest persecution in European history. The geographical spread of witch hunting followed predictable patterns. The Holy Roman Empire, with its fragmented political authority and intense religious conflicts, became the deadliest killing ground. The prince-bishoprics of Würzburg and Bamberg, where Anna Riedemann died, were merely the most efficient examples of a persecution that claimed tens of thousands across German territories. The demographics of persecution reveal the deeper social dynamics at work. Approximately 80% of victims were women, reflecting medieval beliefs about female weakness and susceptibility to diabolic influence. The accused were disproportionately drawn from marginal populations, widows without male protection, elderly women dependent on community charity, healers and midwives whose medical knowledge seemed suspiciously effective, and social nonconformists who challenged established hierarchies. But the witch hunts also revealed the arbitrary nature of persecution. When accusations began, they could strike anyone regardless of social status, piety, or previous reputation. The case of Johannes Junius in Bamberg was repeated across Europe as witch hunting consumed judges, priests, and nobles who had initially supported the trials. In Salem, Massachusetts, the accusations reached the wife of the governor before the trials were finally suspended. The methods of persecution were standardized across Catholic and Protestant territories alike. The process typically began with denunciation, neighbors accusing neighbors of malevolent magic. These accusations were investigated by courts that had abandoned normal legal protections in favor of procedures specifically designed for the crimen acceptum of witchcraft. Torture was employed not just to extract confessions, but to force the accused to name accomplices, creating ever-expanding networks of alleged diabolic conspiracy. The confessions produced under torture followed remarkably consistent patterns across different countries and decades. Accused witches admitted to making pacts with Satan, attending sabbats where they worshiped the devil, and planned evil acts engaging in sexual relations with demons and causing harm through malevolent magic. These similarities were taken as proof of the reality of diabolic conspiracy, when in fact they reflected the standardized, questioning techniques used by inquisitors and the limited imaginative frameworks available to torture victims seeking to end their agony. The Sabbat, the supposed gathering where witches worshiped Satan, became the central organizing myth of the persecution. Described in countless confessions extracted under torture, these gatherings allegedly took place on remote hilltops or in abandoned buildings, where covens of witches would renounce Christianity, engage in blasphemous rituals, and plan acts of malevolent magic. The diabolic Sabbat served multiple functions in the witch-hunting imagination. It explained how dispersed acts of malevolence could be coordinated, provided salacious details that fascinated both prosecutors and public audiences, and created a framework for expanding accusations indefinitely. The economic dimensions of witch persecution were as important as the religious and social factors. Accused witches had their property confiscated to pay the costs of their prosecution and execution. In territories where trials were frequent, this created perverse incentives for authorities to pursue cases aggressively. The wealth of defendants could literally fund the apparatus of their own destruction. Some of the most intense persecutions occurred in regions where property confiscation made witch hunting profitable for local authorities. The role of professional witch hunters was crucial in spreading and sustaining the persecution. Men like Johann Riedemann, who orchestrated Anna Riedeman's destruction, traveled from territory to territory, offering their expertise in identifying and prosecuting diabolic conspiracies. These specialists carried standardized procedures, legal precedents, and torture techniques that homogenized the persecution across diverse political and cultural contexts. They were the entrepreneurs of fear, making their living from the systematic destruction of their fellow Christians. The printing press played a decisive role in spreading witch-hunting ideology. The Malleus Maleficarum went through dozens of editions and was translated into multiple languages. Legal handbooks, theological treatises, and sensationalized accounts of witch trials circulated throughout educated Europe, creating a shared intellectual framework that made local persecutions seem part of a continental struggle against diabolic evil. Popular pamphlets describing lurid details of witch confessions found eager audiences in towns and cities across the continent. The medical profession, such as it existed in early modern Europe, was deeply complicit in the witch hunts. Physicians were called upon to examine accused witches for devil's marks, supposedly supernatural signs of diabolic allegiance. It could be anywhere on the body. The search for these marks involved intimate physical examination that was itself a form of sexual assault. Medical authorities also provided pseudoscientific explanations for phenomena attributed to witchcraft, lending scholarly credibility to popular superstitions. The persistence of witch persecution across 3 centuries demonstrates its deep roots in European culture and society. The trials survived the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the early Enlightenment because they served important social and psychological functions beyond their ostensible purpose of combating diabolic evil. They provided communities with mechanisms for managing social tensions, eliminating unwanted members, and demonstrating collective solidarity against perceived threats. The gender dynamics of witch persecution reflected and reinforced patriarchal power structures throughout European society. The overwhelming targeting of women, particularly elderly women, and those who lived independently of male authority, served to police female behavior and reinforce masculine control over community life. The stereotype of the witch, an aged woman living alone, knowledgeable about herbs and healing, sexually autonomous and economically independent, represented everything that patriarchal society found threatening about female power. The theological debates surrounding witchcraft revealed deep tensions within Christian doctrine about the nature of evil, the limits of divine power, and the relationship between natural and supernatural causation. Catholic authorities emphasized the role of demonic intermediaries in causing worldly harm, while Protestant theologians were more likely to attribute suffering directly to divine will. But both traditions accepted the reality of diabolic magic and the necessity of destroying those who practiced it. The legal innovations developed for witchcraft prosecution had lasting effects on European jurisprudence. The acceptance of spectral evidence, the use of torture to extract confessions, the reversal of presumptions of innocence, and the creation of special procedures for exceptional crimes established precedents that would influence legal systems for centuries. The witch trials represented not a temporary abandonment of legal rationality, but a systematic development of new forms of judicial procedure designed to facilitate conviction rather than determine truth. The logic of witch persecution contained the seeds of its own destruction. As the trials in Würzburg expanded beyond Anna Riedemann and her alleged accomplices, they began to consume the very social and political elites who had initiated them. By 1629, the burnings had reached into the nobility, the merchant class, and even the clergy itself. The turning point came with the arrest of Johann Junius, Burgermeister of Bamberg, and one of the most prominent citizens in Prince Bishop Gottfried Dornheim's territory. Junius had initially supported the witch trials, seeing them as necessary measures to restore social order. But when accusations reached his own family, his wife was arrested and burned in 1628. His enthusiasm waned considerably. Junius's own arrest in 1629 marked the moment when witch persecution began to devour its own architects. His case file, preserved in the Bamberg archives, provides extraordinary insight into the psychology of accusation and confession. Under torture, this pillar of the community confessed to decades of diabolic activity, claiming he had first been seduced by Satan in 1624 during a period of political stress. But Junius managed to smuggle a letter out of prison that revealed the truth behind his confession. Written in his own hand and hidden in his clothing when he was burned, the letter described in agonizing detail how torture had broken his will and forced him to invent the elaborate diabolic narrative his captors demanded. They never cease to torture until one confesses something. He wrote, "If I had not confessed, the torture would have continued until I died under it." This letter, discovered after Junius's execution, began to raise uncomfortable questions among the surviving elite of Bamberg and Würzburg. If a man of Junius's unquestioned piety and social standing could be forced to confess to witchcraft, what did that say about the reliability of all confessions? If the devil could corrupt a burgomaster, who was safe from accusation? The witch trials had begun as a tool of social control, targeting marginal figures like Anna Riedemann, who could be sacrificed without destabilizing existing power structures. But the internal logic of diabolic conspiracy made it impossible to contain the accusations within safe boundaries. Each confession generated new names, and the social status of the accused gradually rose as the pool of marginal suspects was exhausted. By 1630, the trials had claimed a nephew of Prince Bishop Dornheim, several cathedral canons, and the sons of prominent burgher families. The economic costs were also mounting. Confiscated property initially enriched court coffers. But as wealthy defendants hired skilled lawyers and appealed to higher authorities, the trials became financial drains rather than profit centers. The intervention of external authorities proved decisive in ending the Great Witch persecution. Emperor Ferdinand II, initially supportive of zealous counter-Reformation measures, became concerned as reports reached Vienna of noble families being destroyed by witch accusations. The papal nuncio expressed alarm at confessions extracted from clergy members, suggesting that torture was generating false testimony rather than revealing diabolic truth. Most importantly, the Swedish invasion of southern Germany in 1631 provided a face-saving opportunity to suspend the trials. Military necessity required the unity of all Christians against Protestant heretics. Internal purification would have to wait until the external threat was defeated. Prince Bishop Dornheim fled Bamberg ahead of Swedish forces, taking with him the administrative apparatus that had sustained the witch trials. The final executions in Würzburg took place in early 1631, exactly 3 years after Anna Riedemann's death. The total death toll from the Würzburg trials numbered 637, people roughly 10% of the city's population. Bamberg lost even more, over 1,000 executions from a smaller population base. Entire family lines were extinguished. Whole neighborhoods emptied as residents fled to territories where the witch-hunting fever had not taken hold. The decline of witch persecution came not through sudden enlightenment, but through gradual erosion of the beliefs and institutions that had sustained it. The process began in the 17th century as educated elites increasingly questioned the reliability of evidence obtained through torture and the theological assumptions underlying diabolic conspiracy theories. The scientific revolution played a crucial role in this transformation. As natural philosophers like Galileo, Newton, and Harvey revealed the mechanical laws governing physical phenomena, supernatural explanations for natural events became less compelling. Weather patterns could be understood through atmospheric pressure rather than diabolic manipulation. Diseases spread through contagion rather than magical curses. The expanding realm of natural causation left less space for supernatural intervention. Legal reforms were equally important in ending the persecution. Jurists across Europe began to demand higher standards of evidence for witchcraft accusations, to restrict the use of torture, and to require corroboration of confessions through independent testimony. The Spanish Inquisition, ironically, became one of the most skeptical institutions regarding witchcraft accusations, developing rigorous procedures that made convictions extremely difficult to obtain. The last official execution for witchcraft in the Holy Roman Empire took place in 1775, exactly 147 years after Anna Riedemann's death. The victim was Anna Guldi, a Swiss servant woman accused of bewitching her employer's daughter. Her execution caused a scandal across educated Europe and marked the effective end of judicial witch hunting in the German territories. But the end of official persecution did not mean the end of popular belief in witchcraft. Rural communities continued to harbor suspicions about malevolent magic well into the 19th century. Cunning folk and wise women still practiced traditional healing and divination. The difference was that these activities were no longer subject to systematic persecution by state authorities. The memory of the witch hunts was actively suppressed in many regions as later generations sought to forget this embarrassing chapter in their history. Court records were destroyed, memorials were removed, and the victims were forgotten. Only in recent decades have historians begun to reconstruct the full scope of the persecution and honor the memory of its victims. The European witch hunts may seem like ancient history, but their patterns of fear, accusation, and scapegoating have repeated throughout modern times. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 brought the European model to colonial America, claiming 25 lives before skeptical intervention ended the persecution. The accusations followed familiar patterns: marginal women targeted first, confessions extracted through psychological pressure, expanding circles of accusation that threatened to consume entire communities. The 20th century witnessed numerous episodes of mass hysteria that echoed the witch-hunting mentality. The Red Scares in America saw thousands accused of communist sympathies based on flimsy evidence and guilt by association. McCarthyism employed many of the same techniques that had destroyed Anna Riedemann: public accusation, demand for confession and denunciation of others, punishment of those who refused to cooperate with investigations. The daycare sex abuse panics of the 1980s and 1990s demonstrated how easily modern societies could fall prey to collective delusions. Dozens of childcare workers were imprisoned based on children's testimony obtained through leading questions and psychological manipulation. The McMartin preschool case in California, the Fells Acres case in Massachusetts, And similar prosecutions across America and Europe showed that belief in impossible conspiracies remained alive in supposedly rational modern societies. More recently, the QAnon conspiracy theory has revived many elements of the witch-hunting mentality: belief in vast hidden conspiracies, the targeting of vulnerable populations, the demand for public confession and denunciation, the rejection of evidence that contradicts predetermined beliefs. The Pizzagate incident, where a gunman invaded a Washington, D.C. restaurant based on internet conspiracy theories, demonstrated how digital age rumors could motivate real-world violence. The psychological mechanisms that drove the witch hunts remain active in human nature. The need to find someone to blame for suffering, the comfort of simple explanations for complex problems, the social cohesion created by shared enemies. These impulses persist across centuries and cultures. What changes are the specific targets and justifications, not the underlying patterns of persecution. Social media has created new possibilities for mass accusation and public shaming that echo the dynamics of early modern witch hunting. Cancel culture, while addressing real issues of accountability, sometimes employs methods reminiscent of diabolic conspiracy theories. Guilt by association demands for public confession, the expansion of accusations to encompass entire social networks. The speed and reach of digital communication can transform isolated incidents into global controversies within hours. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how quickly fear could revive scapegoating behaviors. Asian Americans faced harassment and violence based on the virus's origins in China. Anti-vaccine activists were demonized as threats to public health. Conspiracy theories flourished about the pandemic's causes and cures, echoing the supernatural explanations that had once attributed plague to witchcraft. The rise of authoritarian movements worldwide has seen the revival of techniques pioneered during the witch hunts. The identification of internal enemies, the use of confession and denunciation to destroy opposition, the creation of parallel legal systems to circumvent normal protections. These methods have been employed by totalitarian regimes, from Stalin's Soviet Union to Mao's China to contemporary authoritarian movements. Climate change has generated new forms of apocalyptic thinking that sometimes echo the diabolic conspiracy theories of the early modern period. Some environmental activists describe corporate executives and climate deniers in terms reminiscent of medieval demonology, while some climate skeptics portray environmental scientists as participants in vast conspiracies to destroy industrial civilization. The polarization of climate debate sometimes resembles the religious conflicts that fueled the original witch hunts. The #MeToo movement, while addressing genuine issues of sexual harassment and assault, has occasionally employed methods that echo witch hunting dynamics. The presumption of guilt, the rejection of due process protections, the demand for public confession and denunciation, these elements have appeared in some high-profile cases, leading to concerns about fairness and proportionality. The persistence of conspiracy theories in modern politics demonstrates the continued appeal of explanatory frameworks that attribute complex problems to hidden malevolent forces. Deep state theories popular among some political movements echo the diabolic conspiracy beliefs that once justified burning women like Anna Riedemann. The conviction that secret cabals of evil actors control world events provides the same psychological comfort that witchcraft beliefs once offered to medieval communities. The European witch hunts represent one of history's most systematic campaigns of judicial murder, claiming between 40,000 and 60,000 lives over 3 centuries. But their significance extends far beyond the raw casualty figures. They demonstrate how quickly civilized societies can turn to barbarism when fear overcomes reason and legal safeguards are abandoned in the name of exceptional threats. Anna Riedeman's story encapsulates the human cost of this collective madness. She was not a historical figure of great importance. No armies followed her, no treaties bore her signature, no great works of art or literature carry her name. She was simply a skilled midwife who helped women through the dangerous process of childbirth, in an age when such help could mean the difference between life and death. Yet Anna's fate illuminates broader patterns that extend far beyond early modern Europe. The witch hunts emerged during a period of social stress, religious conflict, and political fragmentation remarkably similar to challenges facing our own world. Economic disruption, demographic change, and technological transformation created anxiety that found expression in scapegoating vulnerable populations. The intellectual frameworks that justified witch persecution, the Malleus Maleficarum and its countless imitators, provided pseudo-scientific legitimacy for mass violence. These texts created coherent explanatory systems that made random suffering appear purposeful and gave communities concrete targets for their rage. The witches may have been imaginary, but the fear they represented was devastatingly real. Perhaps most disturbing is how the witch trials were conducted not by ignorant mobs, but by educated elites using sophisticated legal procedures. The judges, prosecutors, and theological advisors who condemned Anna Riedemann were products of Europe's finest universities. They applied the most advanced jurisprudential theories of their time. They kept meticulous records and followed established protocols. The horror of the witch hunts lies not in their irrationality, but in their systematic rationality. The persistence of witch hunting mentalities in modern times demonstrates that the capacity for collective delusion and mass persecution remains embedded in human nature. The specific targets and justifications change, but the underlying patterns persist. The search for scapegoats. During times of crisis, the appeal of conspiracy. Theories that provide simple explanations for complex problems. The willingness to sacrifice vulnerable individuals for the supposed benefit of the community. The digital age has created new possibilities for mass accusation and public destruction that echo the dynamics of early modern witch hunting. Social media platforms can transform isolated accusations into global controversies within hours. Online mobs can destroy reputations and livelihoods based on incomplete information and presumptions of guilt. The speed and scale of digital communication amplify both the reach and the destructive potential of modern witch hunts. Educational systems that emphasize critical thinking, evidence-based reasoning, and historical awareness provide some protection against mass hysteria. But education alone is insufficient. Highly educated societies have proven just as susceptible to collective delusions as their illiterate predecessors. The physicians, lawyers, and theologians who orchestrated the original witch hunts were the intellectual elite of their time. Legal protections, due process, presumption of innocence, protection against self-incrimination, independent judiciary offer more reliable safeguards against persecution. These principles were developed partly in response to the horrors of the witch hunts and similar historical injustices. But legal protections are only as strong as the societies that maintain them, and they can be eroded or abandoned when fear overcomes rational judgment. The end of the great witch persecutions came not from moral awakening, but from practical considerations. When the trials began consuming the social elites who had initiated them, those same elites discovered the dangers of uncontrolled accusation. When military necessities required social unity, diabolic conspiracies became inconvenient distractions. The witch hunts ended not because people stopped believing in witches, but because other concerns took precedence. This pragmatic resolution offers both hope and warning for our own time. Human societies possess tremendous capacity for self-correction when existing systems prove dysfunctional. But that correction often comes only after terrible damage has been done, and only when those with power find their own interests threatened. The challenge for each generation is to recognize and resist destructive patterns before they claim too many victims. Contemporary memorialization efforts attempt to honor the victims of witch persecution and extract lessons for modern times. Memorial plaques, museum exhibits, and academic conferences keep the memory of the witch hunts alive in public consciousness. But remembering is not enough. Understanding is what matters. The victims like Anna Riedemann deserve more than our sympathy. They deserve our commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The witch hunts teach us that civilized behavior is fragile and must be actively maintained. They show us how quickly societies can turn to barbarism when fear overcomes reason. They demonstrate the importance of protecting vulnerable populations and maintaining legal safeguards even during times of crisis. Most importantly, they remind us that each individual has a choice to participate in collective persecution or to resist it, to seek scapegoats or to demand evidence, to follow the crowd or to stand alone for truth. Anna Riedemann burned to death on April 10, 1628, in Würzburg's main square. Her ashes were scattered in the Main River, and her name was struck from official records as that of a condemned heretic. For 3 centuries, she was forgotten, one victim among thousands in a persecution that embarrassed later generations of Germans. Today, a small memorial plaque marks the approximate location where Anna died. Placed there in 1987 by the city of Würzburg, it honors the victims of superstition and judicial murder. The inscription, in German and English, reads, "Here and in places like this, people were executed for witchcraft. Let us remember them and ensure such horrors never happen again." But remembering is not enough. Understanding is what matters. Anna Riedemann died because her community chose fear over compassion, suspicion over evidence, and vengeance over justice. She died because good people remained silent while their neighbors were destroyed. She died because those with power found her destruction useful for their own purposes. Her story asks uncomfortable questions that each generation must answer anew. When faced with crisis and uncertainty, will we seek scapegoats or solutions? When our neighbors are accused, will we demand evidence or accept rumors? When authority exceeds its bounds, will we resist or comply? When fear spreads through our communities like plague, will we succumb to its contagion or will we stand as witnesses to truth? The witch hunts ended more than 3 centuries ago. The capacity for such collective evil did not. In Anna Riedemann's memory, and in memory of the thousands who burned beside her, we must remain vigilant against the eternal human temptation to solve our problems by destroying each other. The flames that consumed her body were fueled not by wood and oil alone, but by fear, hatred, and the abandonment of mercy. Those same fuels burn as readily today as they did in 1628. The choice, as always, is ours.